past couple of weeks on Wednesday nights, we've been talking about the Bible's historical context. We focused primarily on the exile going into the intertestamental period, which is the fancy name for the period in between the Old and New Testaments. This was a period of Jewish history that was extraordinarily difficult and full of change. This period began with changes to the global political climate as the Assyrian Empire rose and eventually took the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. Then Assyria was overthrown by the Babylonian Empire, which also exiled the southern kingdom of Judah. Babylon was ultimately conquered by the Persian Empire, and the Jews were allowed to return home in stages. That's where the Old Testament leaves off, with the people settling back into the land, waiting for the promised Messiah. But even more changes occurred during the intertestamental period, the approximately 430-year period in between the Old and New Testaments. Persia was ultimately defeated by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And Alexander's goal was not only to conquer the known world, but he wanted to unite the world through Hellenization, the spread of Greek culture and language. After Alexander the Great died, the Greco-Macedonian Empire fell into civil war and ultimately split into two rival kingdoms, the Ptolemaic dynasty in the south in Egypt, and the Seleucid dynasty to the north in Syria. And Palestine, Israel and Judah, was caught right in the middle of this feud. They fell under Ptolemaic control first, which was a pretty peaceful period for the Jews. The Ptolemies facilitated a gradual assimilation of Greek culture into Jewish society. They produced a Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, and a Jewish community thrived in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. But then the Seleucids took control of Palestine. Their king, Antiochus Epiphanes, was not satisfied with gradual assimilation. He wanted to replace Judaism with Hellenism. So he outlawed circumcision and the law of Moses and other Jewish observances. He looted the temple and built an altar to Zeus inside the temple, where he offered pigs and other unclean animals as sacrifices. He completely desecrated the temple. This led to a revolt led by Judas Maccabeus. Judas was later killed in battle, but his brothers, Jonathan and later Simon, picked up the leadership in his place. Simon eventually gained Judah's political independence and named himself leader and high priest, establishing what was known as the Hasmonean dynasty, named after one of their ancestors, Hasmon. Simon was ultimately succeeded by his son, John Hyrcanus, who aimed to expand Judah's territory. He conquered Idumea, which is the Latin name for Edom, which you may remember is made up of Esau's descendants to their south, and he conquered Samaria to the north. Samaria was the region that had formerly been the northern kingdom of Israel, named after Israel's capital city. If you remember from a couple weeks ago, the Assyrians liked to relocate the peoples they conquered. So they took the people of Israel and moved them somewhere else, and then moved someone else into the land of Israel. These foreigners that came into the land held the pagan beliefs that every land had its own god, so they requested someone to teach them about the God of Israel. The Assyrians assigned a few Israelite priests to go back and teach them about Yahweh and how to worship him. Meanwhile, the actual Israelites were exiled in another place with other people, and they were in exile for about 200 years, so they started intermarrying with other cultures. By the time they returned from exile, they're no longer pure-blooded Israelites, and they've adopted some aspects of these other cultures. They're not the same people who left. And then they return to this other people who have some similar beliefs and practices and start intermarrying with them. They still followed the law of Moses. They kept Genesis through Deuteronomy as their scriptures, but they made some changes. There are approximately 6,000 differences in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Most of them are minor spelling or vocabulary differences due to changes in the language over the years. but some were pretty significant changes. Any references to Mount Moriah, also known as Mount Zion, were changed to Mount Gerizim, which is found in Samaria. And an 11th commandment was added to the original 10 commandments, instructing them to build an altar on Mount Gerizim. Eventually, around the same time the Jews were constructing their second temple after their return from exile, the Samaritans also built a temple on Mount Gerizim. All of this is in direct competition with the Jews. And then when John Hyrcanus conquered Samaria, he marched his army straight up Mount Gerizim and burned down this Samaritan temple. We see the tension between Jews and Samaritans in the New Testament, but the Bible never provides a clear explanation for it. Part of it goes all the way back to the split between Israel and Judah, but all of these changes that occurred during and after the exile added to that, and with the destruction of the Samaritan temple, the conflict just boiled over. I would encourage you to go back and read the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, and particularly the story about the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4, to see what light this context sheds on those passages. John Hyrcanus was succeeded by his son Alexander, who continued to expand Judah, gaining as much territory as Israel had once had under David and Solomon. However, Alexander openly adopted Hellenism, the very thing his great-grandfather, grandfather, and great-uncles had rebelled against. This created some tension, particularly with some of the more religious citizens. Besides, the Hasmonean dynasty was not legitimate in their eyes. The Hasmoneans claimed to be priest-kings. They were legitimate priests, descended from Levi, but they were not descendants of David, and therefore could not be king. So there arose a religious group known as the Hasidim to separate from the Hasmonean dynasty, reject Hellenism, and preserve proper Jewish beliefs and customs. This is the origin of the division in Acts chapter 6 of the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenistic Jews. The Hasidic Jews held strictly to the Hebrew culture, while the Hellenistic Jews assimilated to the dominant Greek culture. The Hasidim further divided into two groups, each with its own way of achieving this purpose of separating from the Hasmonean dynasty and the dominant culture. The Essenes completely separated themselves from society in order to avoid any contamination or corruption in their quest to strictly observe the law of Moses. Most scholars today believe that the desert community of Qumran, which produced what we refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, was one of these Essene communities. The second, more well-known group that probably arose from the Hasidim were the Pharisees. The name Pharisee actually comes from a Hebrew word for separatists, signifying their desire to be spiritually and religiously separate, and even physically separate from other cultures and people that might pollute their so-called holiness. And the Pharisees codified a set of traditions known as the Mishnah that were at the center of many a controversy in the New Testament. But their goal with these traditions was to build a fence around the law of Moses. If you kept the traditions, you wouldn't be in any danger of breaking the law. If you broke the tradition, then at least you didn't break the law, but may be reminded not to stray too far. The problem was, the more they emphasized the traditions, the more they equated the traditions with the law itself. The Pharisaic movement may have started from a good place, a desire for purity and strict obedience, but it had been taken too far and had even become corrupt itself by the time of the New Testament. Of course, with opposition rising against the Hasmonean dynasty, other groups formed to support it. This is most likely where the Sadducees came from. They were part of the priestly aristocracy and were comfortable with someone from their background being both ruler and high priest. This group only considered the law of Moses to be fully authoritative scripture, and gave much lesser weight to other parts of the Old Testament, so they did not believe in things such as angels or the resurrection of the dead as the Pharisees did. Because they didn't accept texts like Samuel and Kings, they rejected the whole notion that the line of succession belonged to David's descendants. That's why they were okay with the Hasmonean dynasty, whereas the Pharisees thought it was illegitimate. But if you extend that idea further, the Sadducees rejected the belief that one particular descendant of David would be the ultimate ruler over Israel. They didn't believe, as much of Israel did, in the coming Messiah, because any such king was a threat to their own power. The Hasmonean dynasty ended with the next generation. Alexander's two sons, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus II, were caught in a power struggle, greatly weakening their power and opening the door for the Roman general Pompey to conquer Jerusalem. The Romans made Hyrcanus II high priest and ethnarch. However, the real power was held by Hyrcanus' advisor, Antipater. Antipater was the true administrator and tax collector for the Roman province of Judea, and he had done some kind of favor for Pompey, so he got some brownie points with the Romans for that. Antipater was an Idumean, an Edomite, but the Romans didn't really distinguish between the Idumeans and Jews since Idumea had been conquered by John Hyrcanus. According to Josephus, John Hyrcanus had also instituted a policy of forced conversion to Judaism, so Antipater's family at the time they were conquered was supposedly forced to convert and be circumcised. Josephus even records that Antipater was born a Jew even though he was technically an Idumean. The Romans ultimately made Antipater governor of Judea, and he appointed his two sons as military governors of Jerusalem and Galilee. Antipater was assassinated in 43 BC, and a power struggle broke out between his two sons and Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus II, from the Hasmonean line. One of his sons was captured and committed suicide. The other fled to Rome and returned with the Roman army to put an end to the Hasmonean dynasty once and for all. The Romans made this son of Antipater known to us as Herod the Great, the king of the Jews. When the Roman Republic fell into civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian, Herod sided with Antony and his ally Cleopatra. When Octavian won and reformed the Republic into an empire, making himself the first emperor, or Caesar, with the honorary title Augustus, which means exalted one, Herod somehow managed to convince Caesar that he had been loyal to him all along so that he could keep his position. Mark Strauss describes Herod the Great as a strange mix of a clever and efficient ruler and a cruel tyrant. Because of the way he gained and maintained his position, he was suspicious of everyone, quickly and ruthlessly shutting down even a hint of conspiracy against him. Of course, the Jews didn't like him because he wasn't really a Jew and, in their mind, had no claim to rulership over them. In an attempt to change that perception, he divorced his wife and married a Hasmonean princess, but he eventually suspected her of plotting against him and had her executed. And he didn't stop there. He also murdered 3 of his sons, another wife, and his mother-in-law because he was afraid they were conspiring against him. So it's no surprise that when he heard of a king born in Bethlehem, he ordered the execution of all baby boys so that Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt with Jesus. However, Herod tried to keep portraying himself as a Jew, a good Jew even, in an attempt to gain the favor of the people. He refused to eat pork and other unclean animals. Herod encouraged the development of synagogues, he remitted taxes, and he provided free grain in times of difficulty. His biggest project was the renovation of the Jewish temple. That might be another difference between the Old and New Testaments that you've noticed. When they were rebuilding the temple in the Old Testament, the prophet Haggai had to encourage the people because they had been disappointed by the size and lack of grandeur that the new temple had compared to the first temple. Yet in the New Testament, it's a huge, luxurious complex. Well, that's because of Herod's renovations, making it bigger and grander than it had even been in the days of Solomon when it was first constructed. During Herod's reign, Judea prospered economically. Herod continued to expand their territory and built fortifications. He also built Greek theaters and stadiums, continuing to spread Greek culture throughout Judea. The upper classes generally supported this. The Sadducees were fine with it, anything to keep their power. These groups that supported Herod's were known as the Herodians, which are mentioned a few times in the New Testament. But it upset the Pharisees and the common people. Herod died in 4 BC. Josephus records that his final order was to have a number of distinguished Jews executed at the time of his death in order to ensure that there were mourners when he died. However, his family did not carry out his final wish and ended up releasing those men after he died. Herod changed his will so many times that it was contested by 3 of his sons. Caesar Augustus ultimately had to step in and settle the matter by dividing their father's kingdom among these 3 sons. Archelaus was ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, with the promise that he would be made king if he ruled well. However, Caesar ultimately removed him from office in AD 6. In Matthew 2, verses 21 through 23, we're told that when Mary and Joseph returned from Egypt with the boy Jesus, they moved to Galilee in order to avoid Archelaus' reign in Judea and Samaria. After Archelaus was removed, control of these regions was given over to various governors. Pontius Pilate was one such governor, as were Felix and Festus, who are all familiar to us from the New Testament. Herod's other son, Herod Antipas, was made tetrarch of Galilee and Perea after his father's death until he was removed by the Emperor Caligula in AD 39. He's the one who had John the Baptist arrested and executed. Herod Philip was tetrarch of several smaller regions to the north and east of Galilee. He's only mentioned once in the New Testament in Luke 3 and verse 1. Herod Philip died without an heir, so at his death his territory was incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. Herod Agrippa, who executed James, the brother of John, and arrested Peter in Acts chapter 12, was Herod the Great's grandson by another of his sons, Aristobulus. And Agrippa's son, Herod Agrippa II, along with his sister Bernice, listened to Paul's defense in Caesarea by invitation of the Roman governor Festus in Acts chapters 25 and 26. And his other sister Drusilla had been married to the previous Roman governor Felix in Acts 24. Now I want to zoom out from just the Roman politics directly affecting Judea to some background for the Roman Empire in general, because this was just established fact and culture that influenced the attitudes and events in the New Testament. One of the main principles for the Roman Empire during this period was Pax Romana, which refers to Roman peace. Much of the world, including the Mediterranean, had never before experienced the political stability created by Rome. The empire established order throughout the empire, establishing a common system of governments within their own hierarchy. The legal system offered certain religious protections, at least most of the time. The Romans built roads throughout the empire, allowing for freedom of movement, which eventually even facilitated the spread of the gospel in Acts. That being said, this peace in many ways was also a facade because they enforced it militarily. They quashed any sign of rebellion. This is why, for example, there was some fear of what would happen when a riot started to form in Ephesus in Acts 19 and verse 40. There were also several incidents with the Jews and Christians in particular where they were punished in order to maintain the Pax Romana. In AD 49, The Emperor Claudius expelled all Jews from the city of Rome due to civil unrest surrounding some person named Chrestus, which is probably a misspelling of Christos or Christ, referring to Jesus. So the conflict between Jews and Christians was viewed as a threat to Pax Romana. Acts 18 and verse 2 even talks about Aquila and Priscilla, who had come from Rome after Claudius ordered them to leave. This event and the Jews' return to Rome after Claudius died precipitated the events of Paul's letter to the Romans. Several years later, in AD 64, a fire broke out in the city of Rome. It's known as the Great Fire of Rome because it destroyed or heavily damaged at least 3/4 of the city, killing hundreds and leaving thousands homeless. After the fire, a rumor started going around that Emperor Nero had ordered the fire in order to clear space for a new palace, and that it had just gotten out of control. Coincidentally, Nero had been out of town at the time of the fire, so many were suspicious of him. He needed a scapegoat to get the attention off himself, and he blamed the Christians. Many Christians were arrested and executed as a result. This is likely when Peter and Paul were both martyred, and the rest were expelled from the city. Tensions between Jews and Christians and the empire had been on the rise for some time. The Jews broke out in full rebellion by AD 66, so Nero sent his general Vespasian to invade Galilee and Judea. Shortly after, Nero died, and Vespasian became emperor, so he returned to Rome and sent his son Titus to complete the conquest of Judea. In AD 70, after a 3-year siege of Jerusalem, Titus took the city, looted and then destroyed the temple, and expelled all Jews from Jerusalem. By AD 73, the Jews' last stronghold fell, and the rebellion came to an end. Titus's victory was commemorated on a Roman coin and also on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome today, depicting him carrying the treasures out of the temple. Titus eventually became emperor himself, as did his brother Domitian, who was emperor at the time Revelation was written. In fact, much of Revelation corresponds to his rule and the events going on in the Roman Empire around that time. I know I've moved pretty quickly to get through the historical context of pretty much the entire Bible, with particular emphasis on the intertestamental period. But I hope this study has given you some greater insight about the Bible, the world in which it took place, and how that world shaped the events we read about in Scripture. It's been a really fun and exciting study for me, and hopefully it has been for you as well.